The universe of Warhammer 40k is one of my favourites, with scores of stories having been written set in the dark future of the 41st millennium. Many of these stories center around the Primarchs, 20 demigods, sons of the Emperor, created to lead his armies during the reclamation of humanity's long-lost empire. And since it's no secret that Games Workshop tends to borrow heavily from real-world history and mythology when writing lore for Warhammer 40k, I thought it would be interesting if we looked at some of the possible inspirations behind the lore and character for each of the Primarchs. First on our list we have Lionel Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels. Raised on the forest world of Caliban by the planet's local human knightly orders, Lion would go on to lead the Caliban Knights in a crusade to reclaim much of the planet from the chaos-tainted beasts that dwelled within its many forests. This crusade was largely successful, with the Lion reclaiming much of Caliban prior to his discovery by the Emperor. Following his discovery by the Emperor, Lion would remain one of his most loyal sons both during the crusade and heresy. Though they were ultimately unable to assist the defenders of Terra, the Dark Angels still managed to wage a brutal scorched earth campaign against the Traitor Legion's homeworlds. Ironically, Lion would soon be forced to destroy his own homeworld, as following the heresy, the Dark Angels present on Caliban rebelled against the Lion. This battle would put Lion into a coma, where he would remain on the remnants of Caliban's crust, now used by the Dark Angels as their flagship, prior to his recent resurrection. Lion's references are a bit more clear-cut than some of the others. His name is a direct reference to the 18th century poet Lionel Johnson. Johnson's most famous work is a poem titled Dark Angel. In the poem, the Dark Angel represents Lionel's own shame and fear, which are constantly weighing on his mind. Lionel fears that the Dark Angel, a symbol of his own perceived sin, will be exposed to the world and he'll be shamed and scorned by it. Very much akin to the Lion's own struggles with secrecy around the destruction of Caliban and the creation of the Fallen. Lion and his legion draw a lot of their character from this poem, not only in their name, but also around the ideas of shame and secrecy. However, while Lion and the Dark Angel's shame was around the Fallen and Caliban, Lionel Johnson's shame was centered around his own homosexuality. Just as Johnson's poem is a reflection of his own inner struggles, Lionel Johnson and the Dark Angel's story represents a similar struggle against the forces of chaos. While the works of Lionel Johnson influence the character of Lion and his legion a lot, I think in terms of a direct historical comparison, the closest would probably be Richard I of England, also known as Richard the Lionheart. Aside from the obvious similarity in name, Richard I was also well known for his crusading, something Lion is similarly well renowned for. In addition, in the Robin Hood mythos, Richard the Lionheart, whilst crusading in the Holy Land, has the kingdom of England usurped from him by Prince John. Similarly, while the Lion is out crusading the Horus Heresy and Great Crusade, he has Caliban usurped from him by Luther and the Fallen Dark Angels. Though the specific events may differ, both of their stories contain the ideas of loyalty and the betrayal of those who are closest to you. Next up we have Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's Children. Fulgrim and his legion pursued perfection and beauty above all else. This would eventually lead Fulgrim and the Emperor's Children down a dark path, ultimately leading to their corruption at the hands of the Chaos God Slaanesh. However, Fulgrim's fall can be attributed in no small part to his own arrogance and innate desire to live up to the expectations of his father, the Emperor. This would lead to Fulgrim's use of a demonically infused sword, which had been taken from a conquered xenospecies known as the Lair. This demonic artifact would feed Fulgrim's own paranoia and desires, culminating in causing him to kill his brother Ferrus Manus on Istvan III. With him and his legion now wholly under the influence of Slaanesh, Fulgrim would begin to turn his legion to a twisted parody of their former beauty and perfection, leading them to devolving into arguably the most depraved out of all the traitor legions. Fulgrim is a bit odd in terms of his influences. He undeniably has roots in Greek and Eastern Mediterranean cultures, with his title as the Phoenician alluding to the ancient Phoenician civilization, known among other things for its production of purple dyes. The colour Fulgrim and the Emperor's Children are often associated with. For a direct historical equivalent, I would have to say Fulgrim shares the most similarities with Alexander the Great, especially in his early years. Not only does Fulgrim look a bit similar to certain depictions of Alexander, but he shares a few key traits as well, the most prominent being their desire to spread culture. Fulgrim, prior to his discovery by the Emperor of Mankind, unified his home planet of Kamos, and incited a cultural renaissance, focused on spreading art and beauty to the rest of Kamos. This parallels Alexander's conquest and subsequent Hellenization of the Near and Middle East. However, while it can be said that Alexander's campaigns were largely ones of either Greek unification or retribution against the Persians, in contrast Fulgrim's motivations seem to be more personal and egotistical, desiring fame and renown in order to be recognized by first the people of Kamos and later by the Emperor. Along with Alexander, I've always gotten an Asian, specifically Chinese monarchy vibe from Fulgrim, but that may just be from the debauchery displayed by him and the Emperor's children later in their life. Actually, while doing research to try to justify this, I came across the ancient Chinese monarch Ji of Xia, and I can hardly think of any other historical figure who embodies the excess and splendor of Slanesh and the Emperor's children as much as this guy. I'll put up a few of his antics on the screen now. Now, if these don't sound like something post-heresy Fulgrim would do, then I don't know what is. Perturabo is the Primarch of the 4th Legion, the Iron Warriors, both a military and technical genius. Him and his legion became masters of siege and attritional warfare, having been raised by his foster father as essentially a living weapon, being used to overhaul the military technologies of his home planet of Olympia, ultimately unifying it after a series of brutal wars. Perturabo's genius is his greatest tool along with his greatest weakness. As though he could design and construct more or less anything he put his mind to, his abilities made it so that he more or less instantly understood any piece of technology he looked at, meaning he lacked the ability to take pleasure in learning new knowledge. This issue was compounded by his hatred of the Emperor's favouring of his brother and rival Rogal Dorn, specifically in the Emperor's decision to have Dorn be the architect of the Imperial Palace on Terra, believing himself to be more worthy of that honour, with his ultimate betrayal stemming from his perceived underappreciation by the Emperor. After siding with Horus, he would go on to be arguably the most competent and effective leader on the traitor side of the heresy. One historical basis that I've seen tossed around online for Perturabo is Archimedes, the famed Greek inventor, credited with the design of the Archimedes claw, a theoretical weapon used to grab and capsize ships, and the Archimedes heat ray, which were a hypothetical series of mirrors used to direct sunlight to burn down ships. Now, a giant claw for grabbing ships and a solar-powered death ray are certainly two things I could see Perturabo creating, using his engineering skills, especially on Olympia. But in terms of his character, I think Perturabo more closely resembles Philip II of Macedon, the ancient Macedonian ruler and father of Alexander the Great. A lot of Perturabo's early life centers around his conquest and unification of his homeworld of Olympia, which is heavily based off of ancient Greece. However, there are also some notable differences between the two. Additionally, Perturabo's main motivations for conquest and domination are influenced more by his own insecurities and desire to prove himself, whereas Philip's motivations were likely more related to his ambition to expand Macedon. Philip's invasion and unification of the Greek peninsula ultimately laid most of the framework for his son Alexander's success, and a lot of people attribute Alexander's success in part to the groundwork that Philip had laid for him. Is there really anything more fitting to Perturabo than doing most of the work and having your more famous relative get all the credit? Fifth, we have Jagatai Khan, Primarch of the White Scars. Arriving on the feudal world of Chagorus, in his youth, Jagatai unified the tribes of the steppe and led them in conquest of his homeworld against the ruling aristocratic empire, using the tactics of speed and lightning warfare to outmaneuver any foe they came across. Though outwardly appearing brutal, Jagatai possessed a strong understanding and appreciation of the arts. However, his outward appearance led to many of his brothers discounting him as being a simple-minded barbarian, only interested in going fast and ramming his bike into Xenos. However, Jagatai did possess an ability few in the galaxy do: common sense, as when the heresy first broke out, he ironically refrained from charging headlong to the conflict, instead remaining neutral until he could ascertain what was going on, ultimately throwing his lot in with the loyalists and being instrumental in the defense of Terra. Following the heresy, Jagatai would return to Chagorus to find it under siege by the Dark Eldar. After breaking the siege, Jagatai would pursue the Eldar into the Webway and was never seen again. Jagatai is arguably one of the easier Primarchs to showcase the influence for, as he draws very heavily from the rulers of the Mongol Empire, with his name being a direct reference to Jagatai Khan, spelled a bit different but pronounced very similar. However, I'd probably have to say that Jagatai is more of a synthesis between two of the most famous Mongol rulers, that being Genghis and Kublai Khan, with his early life on Chagorus being very similar to Genghis's early consolidation of the steppe tribes and his subsequent campaigns against the Chinese states. Moreover, his reorganization of the White Scars into a cohesive military military unit, not bound by tribal loyalties, is directly comparable to Genghis's reforms during the early 13th century. After Jagatai's discovery by the Emperor, the White Scars do begin to take on more of a unified East Asian influence, with emphasis being placed on the arts and poetry, not unlike the Mongols and the Kublai Khan following the establishment of the Yuan dynasty of China. All of this to say that there are rarely ever one influence for a faction in 40k, but the fact that the White Scars are described as Space Mongolians, they could just as easily be considered a synthesis of different East Asian influences. Primarch of the 6th Legion, Leman Russ commanded the Space Wolves during the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. After landing on the frozen death world of Fenris as an infant, Russ would be raised by wolves, not meeting any other humans until his adolescence, where him and his wolf brethren would be inducted into the Fenrisian tribe known as the Russ by their king Thengir. Like most Primarchs, Russ would go on to seize control of the tribe, succeeding Thengir as king of the Russ. Tales of Russ's deeds on Fenris eventually reached the Emperor, who travelled in disguise to Fenris to meet his son, after being challenged by Russ to a series of challenges, with the Emperor losing all but the trial at combat. However, Russ still swore fealty to the Master of Mankind, becoming the second Primarch found after Horus. During the Crusade and Heresy, Russ was tasked with being the Emperor's executioner and carrying out the punishments decreed by the Emperor. This included confronting Angron and the World Eaters for their continued use of the Butcher's Nails, and being tasked with bringing Magnus and the Thousand Sons of Terror to stand trial for their use of psychic powers. This would culminate in the burning of Prospero, where Russ and the Wolves destroyed much of the Thousand Sons Legion and their homeworld after being tricked by Horus. Following Prospero, Russ was largely absent from the other large-scale battles of the Heresy, with his legion being devastated by an Alpha Legion ambush. After the Heresy, much like Jagatai, Russ abandoned the Space Wolves and is believed to have entered the Eye of Terror on his own secret mission. Russ and the Wolves obviously draw a lot of their influence from Nordic history and mythology. One example being that they refer to the Emperor as the All-Father, a title also given to the god Odin in Norse mythology. I'd consider Russ to have the most influence on his character coming from the god Thor, since several of the myths surrounding Leman are more or less directly ripped from the stories about Thor. One example of this is the story around Leman Russ and the Kraken of Fenris, where a young Leman Russ went fishing and caught the father of all Krakens, which is later revealed to be some form of ancient precursor Tyranid lifeform, but deciding it was too small, threw it back into the Sea of Fenris and vowed to catch it when it was fully grown. However, since the Heresy and Leman's disappearance, the legends state that the Kraken has grown so large that its tentacles encircle the entirety of Fenris from beneath the seas. This story is an almost exact retelling of the legend of Thor's fishing trip, with Leman Russ in place of Thor, and the Fenrisian Kraken taking the place of the world serpent Jormungandr. There are a whole lot more stories that just replace Thor with Russ, but one thing I'd like to touch on is the Space Wolves concept of the Wolf Time, which is the prophesized return of Leman Russ to lead the Space Wolves during their final battle, very similar to Ragnarok in Norse mythology. Notably, in Norse mythology, Thor and Jormungandr have their final battle during Ragnarok, ultimately killing each other, and while this is pure conjecture, this may give us some idea of what might happen during Russ's potential return, considering that there are Tyranid hive fleets named both Jormungandr and Kraken. Rogal Dorn is the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, the 7th Legion. Known for his engineering and architectural genius, Dorn built a number of impressive fortifications during the course of the Great Crusade. Dorn's signature sense of duty is a result of his upbringing on the ice-locked world of Inuit, which he came to rule. He was raised by his grandfather, who taught him the art of warfare and strategy. After his grandfather's passing, Dorn became the patriarch of his clan, and began to raise the population of Inuit to a state of limited space travel, eventually discovering and retaking the Phalanx, a massive space citadel that would go on to become the Imperial Fist's fortress monastery. During the Great Crusade, Dorn was seen as one of the Imperium's most competent and effective commanders, earning the admiration of Horus, who claimed that if his lunar wolves ever attacked a fortress defended by the Fists, then the war would last forever. Following Horus's triumph on Ulanor, Dorn and most of the Fist would be recalled to Terra by the Emperor to take up garrison duty in defense of the Sol system. It was then that he would construct the Imperial Palace. During the Heresy, Dorn was quite possibly one of the most important figures on the side of the Loyalists, being the one to oversee the Loyalist war effort and orchestrate the defense of Terra from the Traitors' siege. After the Heresy, Dorn was racked with guilt over his perceived failure to protect the Emperor. After centuries of service to the Imperium and watching his brothers either die or disappear, Dorn was finally believed to have been killed during an outnumbered attack on a Chaos fleet, with only his hand being found. Dorn is one of the tougher Primarchs to find influence for. I've seen a lot of comparison to the Roman Emperor Hadrian, though that may just be because of the link to him and Hadrian's Wall. The figure which I think has the most in common with Dorn would probably be the 17th century French engineer Sébastien Le Perez de Vauban. Vauban is widely regarded as one of the greatest military engineers of his time, helped design and build over 100 fortresses in France, often dubbed the Fortresses of Vauban, which were considered virtually impenetrable and many have lasted through centuries of use. One of the most famous of these was additionally, as well as being a highly proficient military engineer, Vauban's tactics remained largely relevant for both offensive and defensive actions. While I do think that Dorn shares a lot in common with Vauban, it's important to recognize that the goal of this video is to identify historical figures who share traits or characteristics with the Primarchs. While it's certainly possible to find some overlap between these two groups, it's important to remember that each character is an unique individual with their own background, experience, and motivations. Therefore, not every character will fit neatly into a mold of another historical figure, and it can be limiting to try and force that kind of comparison. Konrad Curze, also known as the Night Haunter, is our 8th Primarch. Landing on the lawless, crime-riddled planet of Nostromo, Konrad spent most of his life in the planet's perpetual darkness. Forced to grapple with the depravity and lawlessness of his surroundings and plagued by prophetic nightmares, he came to see himself as a force of justice and retribution against those who committed crime on his planet. For years he led a brutal one-man crusade against the criminal elements of Nostromo, eventually purging the planet of all crime, becoming its first king. Despite his brutal methods, Curze believed that he was carrying out a necessary and righteous mission to purge his home and later the galaxy of corruption and evil. Following his discovery by the Emperor, Curze was raised to be the Primarch of the 8th Legion, the aptly named Night Lords. The Night Lords were trained to be efficient and ruthless, and their cruel and brutal fear tactics quickly became an integral part of their identity. Despite their success in battle, the Night Lords were widely hated and feared for their methods. Throughout all this, Curze himself was troubled by visions of a dark future, which he believed would lead to a civil war among the Primarchs. Curze believed that his visions were the only possible future and fated to happen, therefore acted in a way that would cause this dark future to occur. Rationalizing that if his visions were correct in their predictions, then it meant that he was justified in his actions on Nostromo, as it was all fated to happen. Curze wasn't massively involved in many battles in the heresy, outside of the Dropside Massacre, with most of his legion having been decimated by the Dark Angels, before being captured and imprisoned in stasis by Sanguinius. Post-heresy, Konrad would end up on the world of Seguelsa, where he would ultimately be killed by an Imperial Adeptus assassin, ultimately satisfied that his visions had come true and he had been vindicated. Curze has a couple of influences on his character. His name derives from the book Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, specifically the character of Curze. In the novel, Curze is a mysterious figure who is introduced as a representative of the British Empire in Africa, but is later revealed to be a psychotic and ruthless figure who has gone completely native and become consumed by his own power and authority. This is very similar to the background of Curze, a dark and violent individual feared for their lack of mercy and their willingness to use any means necessary to accomplish their goals. Similarly, there are comparisons to be drawn between him and the ancient Greek lawmaker Draco, who became known for his harsh and unyielding justice and belief in the letter of the law. Like Draco, Curze valued the maintenance of order and justice above all else, even to the point of being willing to enact brutal punishment and torture on those who failed to comply with his expectations. However, I think that Curze, and to an extension the Night Lords, take their influence most predominantly from the 15th century Romanian ruler Vlad III, also known as Vlad the Impaler. Vlad is best known for his brutal and ruthless methods of governing, which earned him the name the Impaler. He was known for his use of impalement as a form of punishment and execution, a practice that led to his lasting reputation as a figure of terror and legend. Both Vlad and Curze share a similar aesthetic of darkness and terror, and a proclivity for violence, and the use of impalement as a means of torture and punishment. Additionally, both characters are known for their extreme sense of justice and their willingness to go to any lengths to uphold their own personal codes. Being that Vlad is also the inspiration behind Dracula, you can see this influence in the Night Lords a lot as well, specifically in their Eastern European accents and the bat motif that surrounds both Konrad and his legion. Our second to last Primarch of this episode is Sanguinius. Sanguinius, also known as the Great Angel, is the Primarch of the Blood Angels Legion, the 9th Space Marine Legion. Sanguinius grew up on the radiation-soaked moon of Bol Secundus, which was plagued by ravenous hordes of mutants. He was adopted by a tribe called the People of the Pure Blood, or simply the Blood. Unlike any other mutant they had ever seen before, he had wings on his back and appeared extremely beautiful. As he grew, he led the Blood against the mutant hordes and began to be worshipped as a god. When the Emperor arrived on Bol, much like Konrad Curze, Sanguinius had already foreseen the arrival of the Emperor and immediately recognized him. Unlike many of the other Primarchs, Sanguinius demanded that the Emperor swear an oath to leave the pure blood of Baal in peace. The Emperor ultimately agreed to Sanguinius' terms regarding the Baalites. Although he had some initial hesitation, Sanguinius agreed to pledge himself to the Emperor as he wished to save the people of the galaxy just as he had saved those on Baal. Once reunited with his legion, Sanguinius transformed them from a savage, despised force teetering on the edge of rebellion to a cultured, noble fighting force based on his Baalite customs. He was therefore revered by the 9th Legion, who up until this point had never received much in the way of respect or commendation for their actions. However, all would not be well for the Blood Angels, as they suffered from a condition brought about by Sanguinius' own genetic material, manifesting in a physical need to consume the flesh and blood of humans. Though he attempted to conceal his son's issues from the wider Imperium, Horus was eventually made aware of their affliction, after which Sanguinius begged him not to tell the Emperor. Horus did keep his word, never telling the Emperor, but that did not stop him from using this fact to attempt to destroy the Blood Angels during the heresy, by leading them to a chaos ambush on Cygnus Prime. This would ultimately fail, and Sanguinius would go on to rendezvous with the Lion, Guilliman, and Ultramar, before striking out to help defend Terra, with the Blood Angels arriving just in time to help prepare Terra to defend against the amassed traitor forces. That Sanguinius did a lot during the Siege of Terra, like single-handedly holding the Eternity Gate, killing Angron, and destroying a Warlord Titan by himself. He was ultimately killed by Horus at the climax of the siege aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Sanguinius derives a lot of his character and story from the angels of the Bible, the most prominent influence being the Archangel Michael. You can see this influence in a lot of the official art of Sanguinius, but one of the most direct examples is his Forge World mini, which appears to be directly modelled off depictions of Michael. Along with the physical similarities, Sanguinius shares a lot of his character arc with Michael, specifically how Michael is depicted in the biblical story of the War in Heaven, not to be confused with the war of the same name from 40k. In truth, the story of the Horus Heresy shares a lot of similarities with the biblical war in heaven, but to summarize, the New Testament tells the story of the angelic war in which Lucifer, one of God's greatest angels, leads several of his brother angels and their armies in rebellion against their creator, very clearly having the same overall themes as the Horus Heresy. In the New Testament, Michael is ultimately the one who defeats Lucifer and casts him and the rebel angels to hell, much like Sanguinius' battle with Horus on the Vengeful Spirit, although it arguably went better for Michael than it did for Sanguinius. Our final Primarch for this episode is Ferrus Manus, also known as the Gorgon, and the Primarch of the Iron Hands Legion. Like his brothers, Ferrus was taken away by the forces of chaos, and spent his early years on the planet of Medusa, where he would wander around the planet, battling its various technological monsters. Over time, Ferrus gained a significant legend to the tribal clans of Medusa, who came to see him as a mythological figure who fought back the creatures of the night. In time, though, Ferrus returned to the Medusan clans, teaching them how to begin using the more advanced technologies, though never fully taking control of the clans, much more content to let them fight out their differences without him getting involved, believing this kept the population of Medusa from becoming complacent. After a few decades on Medusa, Ferrus was eventually found by the Emperor, who he proceeded to fight before ultimately losing and pledging himself to the Emperor's service, satisfied in the fact that he had found a being strong enough to deserve his allegiance. Once given control of his legion, much like the tribes on Medusa, Ferrus would go on to instill the Iron Hands with the ideals of his unflinching pursuit of purging humanity from its perceived weakness. This pursuit would ultimately lead his legion down a dark path, with the Iron Hands dedicating themselves to the idea of strength in cold machine-like logic, as opposed to their own humanity. This would follow their betrayal at the hands of the traitor legions during the ambush on Istvan V, with the Iron Hands taking the largest amount of casualties, with almost all Iron Hands having been killed, and them losing Ferrus Manus when he was decapitated in his duel against the demonically powered Fulgrim. Ferrus is a little less overt in his historical influences than some of his brothers. However, there's a clear parallel between him and the Greek mythological figure Hercules, specifically the story of how Ferrus acquired his Necroderm's hands, the namesake of his legion. It's said that during his time on his homeworld of Medusa prior to his discovery by the Emperor, that Ferrus sought to test himself against the strongest creatures of the planet, eventually coming to a legendary place known as the Land of Shadows, where he did battle with Azeroth, the Great Silver Worm, a great beast coated in living metal. Ferrus was unable to harm Azeroth by any conventional means, but was eventually able to force him into a lava river with his bare hands until he melted, at which point the Necrodermis had now coated his arms. This relates to Hercules since it's a near exact retelling of Hercules' battle with the Nemean lion. In the Greek myth, Hercules' first labor was to slay the Nemean lion, a monstrous beast with a hide impenetrable to any weapon. Hercules slew the lion by strangling it and took the hide for himself, later wearing it as armor to defend himself against other creatures. Similarly, Ferrus Manus fought and defeated the great silver worm, forcing it in a volcano until its necrodermis coat fused with his arm. One difference is that Hercules' labor was forced on him as a punishment for killing his family, while Ferrus' trial was self-inflicted, a test of his strength and determination. However, both characters emerge from this struggle with a powerful new artifact, and both stories highlight the idea that true strength comes from struggling against insurmountable odds, something very much akin to Ferrus and his belief around strength and purging weakness. And with that, we bring to a close part 1 of this episode on the historical influences behind 40k's Primarchs. Stay tuned for part 2 where we'll go over the remaining 10 Primarchs and what they might be influenced by.